President of GeoSrategic Analysis, Mr. Peter Huessy. Thanks for joining us today.
And thank you for inviting me to talk with you today.
Thank you. Mr. Huessy, you have been known in the international arena for years for your research and writing important articles on nuclear deterrences, arms control, and defense policy as well. In your field of study, there are countries such as North Korea, China, Iran, and Syria as well. On the subject of arms control, which is your area of research, there are serious suspicions that the Turkish state is using chemical weapons against Kurdish forces. The Nobel Literature of IPPNW also prepared a report stating that there were serious doubts about the use of chemicals and urging international institutions to take action to form a delegation. So, first of all, did you have the opportunity to examine the report that we sent you as well? So, what would you like to say about the Turkish state's use of chemical weapons?
Well, thank you very much for your. I did read the report. I think this is something that, if we're going to take seriously, we have to go to the very minimum to the United Nations and lay out the evidence. And the problem with arms control, of course, is it's voluntary. A very famous man in the United States, a former Deputy Secretary of Defense, Fred Clay, and before that he was head of the deputy at the Arms Control Arms Control Agency. He said, after you find a violation of arms control, what do you do? The title of his article was "What Then?" And it was written in 1962. And the point is that we don't have an enforcement mechanism for folks who violate arms control or international law with respect to biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons. Go back and look at all the effort we had to do with Saddam Hussein. We first had about 20 some resolution to the United Nations telling him he had to give up his nuclear program. He didn't have nuclear weapons, but program. But he had chemical weapons, and he'd used chemical weapons against his own people. And as you know, we had the same problem with Libya. We've had the same problem with Iran. We've had the same problem with North Korea. All these nice countries, quote unquote, as you know, are the bad guys of international affairs who basically thumb their nose at the international community because it's very difficult to enforce the law. So when you have an allegation back in the 1980s, when we said that the Russians were using chemical weapons in Afghanistan, Americans, academics, people who are very famous said that no, it was bee droppings, which were from the sky in Afghanistan, were dropping on the people. When it turned out that, yes, the Soviets had been using chemical weapons, but it took years and years for that evidence to come out. In the interim, of course, the people who are victims of being hit with these kind of weapons are dead or injured and harmed grievously. And so it's a very slow process. Now, when you have weapons like nuclear weapons that are very big and you have satellites that can tell where they are, you have some mechanism to verify what another country has, like Russia. And that's why we have arms control deals with them. But there is the Biological Weapons Convention. There's the Chemical Weapons Convention, both of which prohibit the use of any of these weapons. Turkey is a member of NATO. They're an ally of the United States. But as you know, they've acted in the last, I would say, decade or so, often contrary to NATO interests, but sometimes they have. But this is a very serious allegation. And the way in which they have treated the Kurds anyway, as well as the way the Iraqis under Saddam Hussein treated the Kurds, the way the Iranians have, the way the Syrians have, it's not unusual to hear some instance of these Kurdish people being harmed by these governments. And tragically is we don't have a lot of transparency as to what is going on, which is what we need to do. You can't make an allegation unless you have transparency. These are very secretive countries. So the evidence that comes out, like on the Iranian nuclear program, you have to basically count on people internally, or in the case of Iran and the nuclear program, it was extraordinary intelligence gathering by the Israelis.
Thank you. Secondly, the chemical gases are included in the scope of the international crime. There
Yes.
are applications made to the OPCW and the United Nations on this matter as well, but they keep their silence. Why do you think they keep in silence? What should be the reason about this silence? There is
Well,
no reaction about it.
as you know, countries don't like to make other countries unhappy with which they have relations. And if there's no pressure to do something, they sweep it under the rug. As I told you about chemical weapons used by Saddam Hussein, the chemical weapons used by the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Uh, we know that these horrible things that go on in the world, it's very difficult to put pressure on countries that are rogue states, as it was now. NATO's ally Turkey is not necessarily a rogue state, but they have some very serious problems with which we have with them, and some of it has to do with Ukraine, some of it has to do with their uh, activities and a tendency to want to be a ruler in the Islamic world, and some of their support of some of the terror groups in Syria, for example. But on this case, constant pressure and publicity is what you need in order to get an assessment of what happened. Okay, because you can't take on just face value necessarily allegations of what happened, because that's just the nature of the world we live in. But transparency, in my mind, is the most critical thing, and we have to get that basically taken care of. And so that's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of time. I'm not sure how soon we can do, but I hope programs like this will help. And it's also a new Congress coming in, and we're going to have another committee in the House, Mr. McCall, who's a very, very good person, and I think that's someone you might want to talk to. What I was saying, sir, is that you're going to probably have a new House majority, however slim it may be. And Mr. McCall from Texas is an extraordinarily good person. He's going to be the new chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the House. I would suggest that's the person to go to, and to get him to assess, asking our own State Department, asking our own government, what do we know about this? And that's the way it's not going to be a very fast process necessarily, because you have to establish the facts. But I would suggest you do that. And if I can help you do that, I would be happy to. I can't work for anybody formally, but I can at least let my voice be heard. And in particular, ask the people I know within this community, people who handle Turkey and Kurdish affairs and who are professionals, to see if they can help. At least let's find out what the facts are, because uh, the use of chemical and biological weapons and like chlorine gas, like in Syria, is a serious thing. Uh, but again, there are those detractors, sir, who will say, "Oh, you're exaggerating. You're trying to make a case where there isn't one." So you do have to, as they used to say on that old TV show, "Just the facts, ma'am." But this is going to take some time to establish them.
So my next question is, if such an event happened elsewhere in the world rather than Kurdistan, if, as the IPPNW stated, there are serious doubts to be investigated, do you think the international institutions will maintain their current silence?
Well, I worked at the United Nations many, many years ago when I was a young person, and I was always surprised at how the art of pushing something, kicking the can down the road, as we say in English in America, is a very well used tactic. And that is, we'll get to it, or it's not important in all the scheme of things. And my view is the way to get around that is to use a member of Congress who has a strong voice to put that out there and say, no, we're not going to sweep this under the rug. I mean, look at the United Nations. They just came out with a resolution condemning Israel for some imagined crimes. And given all the things that Iran does, that Hezbollah, Hamas, ISIS, Al Qaeda, the other terrorist organizations in the Middle East, many of them supported by Iran, you would think that would be a priority. But as you know, sir, international politics can be ugly. It can also be very frustrating. But as I said, I'll help you. And see what I can do to get others to help, because we should at least get the facts on the table. And if these things are going on, particularly with a NATO ally, that's unacceptable in any case. But again, what the actual facts are on the ground is what we need to establish. And as I said, Fred Clay is a very well-known, very famous man. He worked for the Ronald Reagan administration. He worked for other administrations. But as he said, once you find a violation, let's say you establish that, what next? As you know, these sanctions regimes we hear about with respect to Iran or with respect to Syria or with respect to North Korea, they are of varying effectiveness, and a lot of them can't be fully implemented because there are countries like China and Russia and other countries that try to go around the sanctions and undo them. And that, particularly with respect to North Korea, which I know a great deal about in terms of the Korean Peninsula, is a lot of the things we say we're going to do, we don't end up doing because we're not willing to sanction, like Chinese banks, for example, that facilitate North Korea raising money through their criminal enterprises around the world. They sell drugs, they do trafficking in women, they engage in selling information. So, and cyber crimes. I mean, there's a building in supposedly Shanghai devoted entirely to North Koreans who sit in that building day after day, 24/7, doing nothing but hacking into people's computer systems and banking systems around the world. I'll give you one example. I got a call from the FBI, and they said, you better check your bank because someone's been trying to lift $700 out of your bank account, and they tried 7,000 times in the last 2 days. So I went to the bank, and they changed my passwords and everything, and it was the North Koreans and the Chinese, as best they could tell. And so here's an example of what goes on a daily basis, and you don't see it in the news. So when you talk about something where people are victims, like say chlorine gas or some chemical weapon, first they'll ask for the facts, and even then when you get the facts, you have to verify that it did in fact happen. Then you got to look at establishing the record, and then you have to have, okay, what's the consequences? We don't have a very good system in the entire arms control business of what is the consequence of violating treaties and agreements. And I know that in the arms control business, if we find the Russians have 10 more warheads than they're meant to, there's really nothing in the New START treaty, and there wasn't anything in most treaties to punish them, except for you can leave the treaty. And that's difficult to begin with, because you get a lot of criticism for, well, why are you leaving, like the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal, which was a disaster. It actually enabled Iran to get a better capability to enrich uranium, which they're doing, and said nothing about their missiles, nothing about their support of terrorism, nothing about their human rights violations. And that's the only thing we had. And it was basically, and they got rid of sanctions where they got $100 billion to put in their pocket. And what did they use it for? Supporting terrorism. So at the time we said, oh, this is a great deal. It turned out the fact we were facilitating the very terrorism we were trying to stop. And with respect to Turkey, they are a NATO ally. They were critically important during the Cold War for that southern tier of Europe. And so we can't jettison them. On the other hand, to put it mildly, sir, they are a very difficult ally. Some allies are difficult, but let me put it, that's a very mild way to put it, by the way. But again, we have to, with diplomacy, you have to work in a certain way. But again, I think I've always been, every time I've talked with you or on the Kurds, is that I remember in northern Iraq during the war, the Kurds were having conferences with international energy companies to look for investment in that part of Iraq in order to facilitate oil and gas development, in order to help people become prosperous in the midst of a war. And it was extraordinary, the development in that part of Iraq. But again, these are, most Americans, unfortunately, sir, are not quite sure where the Kurds are on a map of the world. On the other hand, we do have an obligation to deal with our friends and those people we need to help. And so I'm glad you're bringing this to our attention, because again, trying to get something in the dominant media in America is an art form that is very difficult sometimes to get a story told. But as I said, you will, I think, have a new House of Representatives, and I would go to the folks in the United States Senate too. Uh, they're some very fine people, and I think this should be brought to their attention too, and including I have a senator from Maryland who's on the Foreign Relations Committee, and he's a very good. He has a lot of credibility, and so if you got him to start looking at this issue, that would be very helpful.
Thank you, dear Peter. That's very important that you are giving a help to the Kurds who are under attack with the chemicals of Turkish army. And you underlined the importance of the USA that should pay attention for that. So in that case, I would love to ask you that shouldn't the US send a delegation to examine the Turkish state's weapons inventory and investigate the chemical gases that are stated to be used in the war zone against the Kurdish forces?
Yeah, it's something we could do, but again, sir, you're going to have to get through a State Department bureaucracy, and you're going to have to get through a foreign policy. Where on the scheme of things does this come as a priority? What level? Because right now, I think our biggest priority probably is avoiding the use of nuclear weapons in over Ukraine. And we are now sitting down with the Russians again for arms control talks, but we invited the Chinese, but they didn't show. So this is an issue I've spent a lot of time on the last year since Putin's invasion of Ukraine. This is a very, very dicey thing. So in terms of, sir, the priorities, I'm afraid climate change probably has a priority over a lot of other things. I don't agree with that, but these are things I think, sir, if there's if this is a serious charge, if this actually did happen, I think you'll have people within the United States Congress and also the think tanks in the world and in the academic community who are concerned with this will look at it. And the question is, what's the evidence? Now, will Turkey allow us to come to their country to look at whatever it is we're meant to go look at? Again, remember the problem with the Syria use of chlorine gas. We drew a red line in the sand, and then the Syrians kind of crossed it, and we didn't enforce it. So that reduced the credibility of any potential American threats. Because as you know, if you don't carry out what you say your policy is, people will think that not just that you're weak, but you don't mean what you say. So again, sir, that's our priority should be to stop any use of gas, number one. Protect people. The second thing is to say, if it happened, why? Who did it? Was it authorized by any particular government? In that case, shut that down. And then third, make sure it doesn't happen again. But sir, this business. This is not an easy effort. It doesn't happen quickly, tragically. People are more interested in looking at listening to Greta Thunberg and how we're all going to die in 12 years from global warming. You can tell I'm not a advocate of what we're doing on where we're basically I'm doing a TV show in New York soon, but it's basically we're telling all of Africa, don't develop natural gas projects for your own consumption, but develop them from Europe so Europe can get the gas that you're going to export. So we're basically saying you're going to starve the people in Africa who 50% of whom don't have access to electricity. And we're going to say that as a sense of saying to them, oh, send the gas to Europe because they're freezing in the dark because of this screw up with respect to the dependency on Russian natural gas. It's a little of a sidelight, sir, but it tells you the crazy politics. And this is a big international issue. There's no bigger issue than, apart from nuclear weapons, there's no bigger issue than energy. And yet policies are completely backward. Okay, so you can imagine how difficult it is on an issue like this that is important because people are suffering. How important it is to get this on the table. I will do what I can. I mean, I can write on this issue. I write for the National Interest. I write for the Federalist. I write for Maven Warrior, and sometimes on John Batchelor's CBS Eye on the World show, and as well as Frank Gaffney's Secure America. So I will do what I can, get the right information and see what I can do to get it distributed to the right people.
Thank you very much. So the next question is, what can be done to mobilize official or non-governmental organizations in the USA on this issue? Can you have a personal initiative? You already answered that you're gonna take the initiative about that, but just to underline it, what else
Well, it's
can
sure
be
it,
done?
yeah. Well, you have to find, you have to, we say you got to find a horse to be your rider. You have a rider. You need to find a horse that's going to take you to where you need to go. And that horse, at the best thing to do, either a member of Congress or a reporter, someone or a reporter who's tenacious enough to say they're going to dig because that's their job, and they can dig and find out the facts and whatever there is and write about it repeatedly, and that in doing so get people to pay attention. That's the best. That's the way, and also do it with a member of Congress. So as I said, I'd be happy to help find out what the facts are, what can be verified, what needs to be investigated, and to, as I said, we're going to have a new Congress, a new House majority. The Senate's still going to be Democratic, narrowly, but on the other hand, this is a non. This should not be a partisan issue. This should be an issue of we don't want to see these kinds of weapons used anywhere in the world, let alone by an American ally. But again, we have to find out what the facts are because Congress will deal with this, but they have to have basically evidence. And unfortunately, it may be tough to get the evidence, but we'll see.
Thank you. So the next one is, what is the international law equivalent of these war crimes committed by the Turkish army? Is it possible for a chemical attack to be brought to international courts? What kind of sanctions can be applied to Turkey in that case?
Well, your sanctions are the ones we did with Saddam Hussein in Iraq, what we've done with the mullahs in Iran. Again, your options other than that are military force, as we did in Iraq. And I don't think Americans have, we're not doing it, go fight our friends, our ally, the Turks. On the other hand, targeted sanctions might get their attention and might be something to use. But unless you have a comprehensive way of going after something, I always go back to what President Reagan did during the Cold War. We used diplomatic, political, economic, and military efforts against the Soviet Union. I'll give you one example. We decontrolled the price of oil immediately in 1981, and everybody says, well, what's that got to do? Well, Russia's primary source of income is oil sales, exports, okay? And when we decontrolled the price of oil, in those days, we took billions and billions of dollars out of the Soviet treasury because the price of oil fell. And then we got the Saudis to increase oil production, believe it or not, by 5 million barrels a day. That further reduced the price of oil. That boomed the economies of the Western world, particularly America. That had a big impact on our strength vis-a-vis Russia. And it also took billions of additional dollars out of the exchequer, as they say, of the Soviets, which was part of a plan to basically dramatically reduce the amount of money they had. Now, under Trump, we reduced Iranian foreign exchange to $4 billion from, I believe, over 100 billion. That was an enormous impact, and it really had an impact on their funding of their terror organizations. Now, with respect to Turkey, Turkey isn't an adversary or enemy. They are an ally. They're a member of NATO. So that makes it a little more problematic, sir, in terms of what you would be willing to do, though you still have the sanctions ability. And if someone's using chemical weapons, biological weapons, doesn't matter. That's a total violation of international standards, of treaty obligations. It's immoral, and I think all those things. And I think if revealed, unlike Syria, the Turkish government would probably put a stop to it, though who knows who authorized the attack, if in fact such attacks occurred.
Thank you. I don't know what kind of scale is your observations with Turkey about Turkey, but Erdogan's Turkey now has the largest number of jailed prison journalists, as well as anybody talks about the chemical weapons, anybody talks about that allegations and this research needs to be done, has been jailed in Turkey as well.
Yes.
Um, So, what is your observations? What would you like to comment on Erdogan's Turkey? Do you think Turkey is going to more Islamist control mechanism? How would you see the Turkey's future?
Well, that I just recently was at a conference of the Nixon Center in which this issue was talked about at some length. And to put it mildly, our relationship with Turkey is very problematic. Erdogan is not running Turkey like Ataturk envisioned. And the harshness and rule of what's going on is really not good. And how to change that is, if I had the answer to that, I'd be probably rich and famous. But we have a lot of work to do to establish, get Turkey on the right plane. I do know my friends tell me that Erdogan would like to be kind of recreate the Ottoman Empire to be the new, caliph of the Islamic world. Um, that's not conducive to being a good ally of NATO. But again, the relationship with Turkey we have is very, very difficult. And it's Erdogan has made it extraordinarily difficult. And that's not going to be turned around easily. But it doesn't get a whole lot of attention, sir. Uh, the major attention is with respect to the Black Sea and access to the Black Sea and whether Russia can come in and out. And there, Turkey has in some respects been helpful, but on the other hand, this is, let me just put it this way, this is a very problematic problem, to put it bluntly, and it's very, very tough, and we haven't spent a lot of time anticipating this. And now that we have this tough relationship with Turkey, we don't have a lot of good answers. And unfortunately, that is often reflected in kind of sweeping things under the rug, thinking, oh, they'll get better. But my view is Turkey, given its geographic location, is critically important to the southern cone of NATO and the Middle East. And we have basically neglected this for too long.
Thank you. Lastly, very shortly, very briefly, if there is anything else you would like to add on regarding on the Turkey's use of chemical weapons and war crimes, crimes against humanity, anything I didn't ask, anything you would like to add on, please have your last words.
Yeah, my last word is we need the evidence as fully as possible in the most credible sources. And we need to make clear that, in fact, if this happened, this is not only not acceptable, but there should be consequences. And I go back to my issue of consequences, what Frederick Clay said many years ago. Once you find a violation, then what? And the thing is to make any kind of agreements where chemical, biological weapons are not to be used and nuclear weapons are to be limited. If you don't have enforcement mechanisms and you don't have transparency, you basically have an agreement on paper which isn't worth what it's written on. Because everything looks nice on paper, but since you don't enforce it and you don't have the evidence to enforce it or the mechanisms, people then, it's just a throwaway line. Oh, we're for arms control. And it doesn't get serious. And this is an issue that, because you're talking here about people's lives being destroyed and taken, this is and harmed. This is serious. As you know, someone could build weapons, but if they don't use them, okay, people haven't been killed. But when people start using these weapons, because they're so indiscriminate, the worry is, well, what happens if that gives other countries saying, well, if Turkey can use them, we can use them. So you have this question of proliferation use. And that, to me, is as bad as the proliferation of the actual stockpiles, is that if Syria can use them and then Turkey uses them, we know countries like North Korea have enormous stockpiles of this horrible stuff. So my view, sir, is we have to go do all due haste to get the evidence on the table and get the transparency so we can find out what happened. And then Congress has to take this as a serious issue, as well as the administration, and move very quickly to get it to stop, find out what happened, and if necessary, have reparations and, also penalties for the harm that was caused.
President of the GeoSrategic Analysis, Mr. Peter Huessy. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for your valuable comments today.
Thank you very much, Erem. I appreciate it very much. Best to all of you there in England.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.